Hello, travelers. Welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. This week, in partnership with the Explorers Club and in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. You can find a complete calendar of live stream events and much more. Welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. This week, in partnership with the Explorers Club and in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. You can find a complete calendar of live stream events and welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, give this a quick stop and let's see if we can start this over again. Sorry, everyone. It sounds like we have a little bit of feedback. Plus, that's coming from somebody else's. And in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. All right, there we go. Ready to go again. Tori, I think maybe perhaps the feedback was coming from your computer. So if you have another window showing the live stream, would you mind just muting it, please? Thank you very much. Much appreciated. All right, here we go. Let's get to it again. If you want to find the complete calendar of live stream events and much more, please visit athome.reachtheworld.org, and you can find all of those events there. Today, I'm so excited. Reach the World is happy to welcome Tori Galloway. Tori is an underwater archaeologist and PhD student at Indiana University, and she's going to tell us how scientists use tools like Scuba and underwater surveys and mapping to help us understand our past. We're also joined today by a couple on-camera students who are going to ask their questions to Tori. And if you're watching via the live stream, you can use the YouTube chat bar to let us know where you're watching from and what grade you're in. You can also share your questions for Tori in the YouTube chat bar, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes or so. So without any further ado, it's time to dive into the world of underwater archaeology. Tori Galloway, welcome to Reach the World.
Thank you, Tim. Share my screen with you. So first off, you may have noticed that I'm joining you from a dive shop. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the gear that I use, the scuba and dive gear that I use as an underwater archaeologist and as a graduate student. And we'll do a little bit of a demonstration there, and maybe I'll even try some stuff on there.
Cool. Hey, Tori, you're just a little bit further back from the computer than we're used to, so you might just have to speak up just a little bit.
How's that for you, Tim?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. So as Tim mentioned, I am an underwater archaeologist and a PhD student. So what does that mean, first of all? Well, this is what I wear when I go to work sometimes, which isn't the most normal thing, especially because I live in Indiana. And sometimes it takes me a boat to get there. Other times, as an underwater archaeologist, I wear business casual and I take the bus to work at the university I work at. So underwater archaeology is basically the study of people and cultures and people groups and social systems through artifacts and features and shipwrecks that tell us things about the past. So I'm an underwater archaeologist specifically, so I look at things only under the water for the most part. And I use scuba as a tool to get me there. So who can be a scuba diver and how? Anyone over the age of 10 with no serious health concerns can be a scuba diver. It does take a little bit of training to get there, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. And of course, anyone with a question and ability to answer that question can be a scientist. So when I was growing up, I didn't think I would be an underwater archaeologist at all. I definitely thought that maybe I would be a nurse or a doctor or a vet or something like that. I knew I was very interested in science, but I didn't know I would be a scuba diver full time. So anyone who is over the age of 10 who has some questions they want to ask can use Scuba as a tool to answer those. So as far as underwater archaeology goes, you may think of it as treasure hunting. You know, you may have heard stories about people who collect coins or projectile points or something like that, but that's not really acceptable in archaeology today. Today, archaeology looks a lot more like this image right here. So this picture is of an anchor in the Dominican Republic, and it's in a marine protected area. And you can see that the anchor has corals and sponges growing on it. It has fish nesting around it, all of the purple on the ceramic in the bottom center. Those are fish eggs. It's really become a part of the environment. So archaeology today, it practices in situ preservation, which is where instead of bringing the artifacts that I want to study to me, I use Scuba or another form to go visit these sites and artifacts so many people after me can come see them as well. That way I'm not changing the site, I'm not disrupting the site, I'm just going there to collect the information that I'm interested in collecting, normally in the form of pictures or video or notes, and then leaving things as I found them. So underwater archaeology has changed a bit, but not so much. In the picture here on the left, you can see there are two divers. This picture was taken in the 1980s off of the Florida Keys. They're mapping a shipwreck called the Infante. It was a shipwreck that was in a fleet that wrecked in a hurricane in 1733. And they're mapping the shipwreck with a hand reel and a tape measure. Picture on the right, I'm doing the same thing. There's a tape measure stretched out across this board that I'm holding on to, and it's an unidentified shipwreck in Lake Michigan. So 40 years later, I'm using the same thing, underwater paper, a pencil, and a tape measure. Another kind of data collection that I do is digital mapping. So in this picture, I'm taking two-dimensional images of a full site with GoPros. And with those pictures, I can make a 3D model of the site. So something that really interests me as an archaeologist is how can we get people to visit these sites who can't scuba dive or who can't swim or who don't have the resources to get there. And one of those ways is through 3D photogrammetry. So by documenting the site and taking all of these pictures and making a 3D model out of it, we can then take these artifacts or features or sites, and first we can document them, which is my job as an archaeologist. And we can second share them to the communities who care about them. So on this slide in this instance, there is an anchor on the left-hand side standing up. This anchor was salvaged back when that was permissible, as I mentioned before. And now it's still sitting behind a marina degrading. They didn't have the resources to conserve it or to keep up with it or anything like that. And now it's degrading above land since it was underwater for so long. The best thing we can do in that situation is to document it. And so we found that 3D photogrammetry is a great way to do that. And so we can effectively track the changes and degradation of that and allow other people to access it who would normally not be able to. So as I mentioned, I'm an archaeologist, and there are a lot of ways that people do archaeology, but specifically I work for a university. There I teach scientific diving classes. So I teach other college students, which is kind of surprising because I'm a graduate student myself. And so this is an image of one of our classes. Our students were taking a test in this picture where they were not allowed to touch the bottom or the top of their pool. So they were trying to do homework and take tests while diving and practicing their scientific diving skills. Also at the university, I'm a researcher, and my job there is to answer questions that I or the Center for Underwater Science may have. This is one of the projects we've been working on for a few years. It's from a site in the Dominican Republic, and this coral is a coral that the center has been monitoring for a while now. And the diver on the left, she's taking a picture of it to make a 3D model of this coral because we actually have the specific measurements and we're tracking how it grows or changes over the years. The coral is named the Emma coral, nicknamed the Emma coral after that diver taking a picture of it. So this digital mapping, when we're not in a PowerPoint, I can show you the site in 3D and you can travel around it just by using the internet. Or we can lay them out flat like this and use them as site maps. So this site map that I have right here, it's the same site with a 2-year difference. And because of a hurricane, you can see that it's changed quite a bit. So with this relatively inexpensive technology, I, as an archaeologist, can map things, do my job, and document them, and also share these sites to the public who may not get to visit them otherwise. We also take a lot of images and collect a lot of video because that's one of the most compelling ways we can document what's happening here. The site in particular, we believe that it was a Spanish vessel incoming into the Dominican Republic somewhere in the mid-16th century. And off of this anchor right here, there's an endangered coral growing that we've been monitoring for a few years now. Also, as an archaeologist, I try to pay specific attention to like biological monitoring. So while I'm on these sites, while I'm using Scuba as a tool to answer the questions I am interested in answering, I also collect data in the form of water samples or notes or images about the biological condition of the site. So in the picture on the left, I'm collecting a water sample, which on the right we are then processing, and we're recording the salinity, the pH, the turbidity, the temperature, and some other characteristics of the site we were monitoring on that day. Here I am on a site called the Enriquillo. It is now a marine protected area off of the Dominican Republic as well. And on the site we were collecting images for photogrammetry, which you can see a screenshot of the model on the left. So that's another 3D model that we can go look at in just 1 minute. So as I mentioned, these 3D models are really useful for showing people things that they might not otherwise get to see. It's also really useful because we can document things in more than just a picture. So I'll show you a 3D model of this. This is early Spanish artillery. It would have basically been a gun on deck of an early Spanish ship. And we're documenting it because it's an active conservation right now, so the state of it is changing. So that's what those 3D models look like. Some of the questions that I have as an archaeologist, they aren't always related to shipwrecks. So sometimes when I tell people I'm an underwater archaeologist, they say, what could you possibly learn from a shipwreck? And it's not always just that simple. In this instance, we were on a ship called the San Felipe that wrecked in a hurricane in 1733 off the Florida Keys as well. And right at this instance, we were learning that some of the wooden hull of the ship had been exposed and uncovered from under the sand by a recent hurricane. So here we're using a shipwreck, but what we're actually monitoring are climate patterns. In the same instance, answers to questions about capitalism, colonialism, trade routes, ship construction, other kinds of industry are also things that we look for through shipwrecks. If you think about it, shipwrecks were how people moved themselves and things around for quite a long time as the primary source. So we can still learn a lot from those sites. So here's another example of an interesting situation from underwater archaeology with an unexpected answer, I guess. This right here is a hand-drawn site map of the 1699 Quedagh merchant. This was the ship of privateer Captain William Kidd, and this project was a project by Indiana University that started in 2009. Right here you can see there's a hand-drawn map, so archaeologists basically went down with reels and tape measures, like you saw in the picture before, and plotted where all of these cannons were. And then they also did a digital map of the site like you saw through the photogrammetry that I mentioned earlier. Basically what's so interesting about this site was that they were able to identify it by very small details, which the archaeologists connected to historical documents. And one of those was the seams of the ship. So by looking at the ship construction down to how the seams were put together on a ship that had been underwater in the Caribbean for a few hundred years, the archaeologist, Professor Charles Beaker, who's in charge of this, was able to correctly identify this ship and trace it back to India. He also used the type of wood So they used microscopes and examined samples from the wood that was found on the ship to identify it as teak, which also comes from India, and to do a geochemical analysis of the ballast stones or the rocks that would go at the bottom of the ship to also trace it back to this specific spot. So once they were able to identify this shipwreck as being the Quedagh Merchant, the ship of privateer William Kidd, they were then able to begin to answer questions about what it was doing there, how it got there, what was on board, and why. As I mentioned earlier, I normally use Scuba or some similar method to study these shipwrecks underwater, but sometimes it takes different tools as an underwater archaeologist. So in these images right here, you can see I am holding what looks like a robot. It is called a remotely operated vehicle, and archaeologists use this. It's basically a robot with a camera on it to reach sites that we are not able to physically reach on our own. This is me deploying it on the left. You can see it has all of this yellow line. Basically, it's connected to a line on the boat where we have a video game controller telling it where to go. That then records video or takes pictures of what we're telling it to, and we're seeing it in real time on a computer, so we can map shipwrecks that are deeper than we are able to go or in conditions that we can't get to. Sometimes archaeology also looks like this. This is what we call parking lot archaeology. And right here, I am getting ready to use what is called ground penetrating radar. So basically this stroller works like a lawnmower. You mow laps in the parking lot as if you would mow your lawn. And it basically shoots down a signal that sends right back up and tells you what is underneath that parking lot. So in this case, we were looking for a shipwreck in a parking lot. Sometimes being an underwater archaeologist means diving things that are not shipwrecks. In this case, I was diving off of the coast of California, and this is the remains of a Corsair airplane that wrecked during a training flight. But sometimes it does mean shipwrecks. So most of my job is mapping these shipwrecks so that they can be nominated to some kind of preservation list, whether that's a state list or a federal list, or it's run by a different country. The main goal is that these are in marine protected areas where people can visit them and support them, but not tear them up or take things. So this is an image of the shipwreck I.A. Johnson. It is a scow schooner in Lake Michigan for World Oceans Week. But basically this shipwreck still has groceries stored underneath that you can see in barrels, which is very, very cool. Archaeologists with the Wisconsin Historical Society mapped this by hand, as you saw with the clipboards and other stuff in the beginning pictures. And then we went ahead and did a digital map of this shipwreck as well, which you can see here. So what you just saw, that little video, is exactly what I would see when I go dive the site, except I would physically be underwater. So as an underwater archaeologist, I talk a lot about diving and the things that I see while diving and the things that I do while diving, but that's not my whole job. Yes, I use Scuba, as you can see in these pictures, and yes, I spend a lot of time underwater. But for every hour that I spend underwater, I would anticipate that I spend 10 hours either in the lab or reading books through historical accounts, or working on dive gear or doing logistics or something like that. So being an archaeologist, it does involve diving and it does involve historical research, but it also involves a lot of education and outreach and conferences and writing reports and doing stuff so that the archaeology is well documented. So I guess when I'm talking about why I became an underwater archaeologist, there are a few things that come to mind. I had all of these questions that I didn't have answers to, and I found out that I could combine that with my love of scuba. And I found out that I could work and promote conservation and preservation while trying to put all of these little puzzle pieces together. So in the picture on the left, I'm looking at an artifact from a shipwreck in the Dominican Republic. And this shipwreck made me ask all kinds of crazy questions. So one question I want to ask for you, you can think about it for a few minutes until we get to the Q&A, is why would a Spanish shipwreck that wrecked in the Dominican Republic have Chinese ceramics aboard? So that's what I was trying to figure out in this question, which is part of my job. And I found out I could promote conservation. Maybe my favorite part about being an archaeologist is working with the local communities. By promoting in situ preservation and digital mapping, it's really easy to let the communities decide what they want to do with their resources and to show them what these sites look like if they can't dive or swim or anything like that. So that's one of my favorite things. So now that you know what I do mainly as an underwater archaeologist and what kind of gear it takes for me to do my job, I want to do a little bit of a gear demonstration and maybe even try on some of the gear that I use and show you how it works. Okay. So the first thing is I dive in a number of different environments. Sometimes I dive and it's really warm out and I wear a bathing suit. And sometimes I dive where it's very, very, very cold water and I wear basically a big trash bag with like 4 layers of pajamas. So I can show you some of the things that I wear. When it's really warm out, I may wear something like this to keep me warm. When it's really cold out, I may wear something like this so that I'm completely dry except for my head and my hands. When I do that, I wear a bunch of suits underneath. So I basically wear a whole snowsuit underneath that to keep me warm. And I wear extra things like a hood and gloves and all of that. So that's what I wear to keep myself warm, but to actually breathe, I have a few different pieces of gear. It kind of depends what I'm doing, what I use. So this is one of them. Put it on for you. And this is basic scuba gear. And basically it has a few parts. So there's this, which is called a regulator, and that's what I breathe out of. And then I have this big part that works like a wing, and I fill it up with air, and that's how I control where I'm diving. And then I carry a tank on my back so that I can breathe on my dive. And then I have all of these lines and controls and straps that I can control my dive with. So I'm going to say something and I want to see if you can tell which character I sound like, okay? So that's how I get air when I'm underwater. I breathe just like I would on the surface through my mouth. And then I also have a mask on. And I do look a little bit like Batman, I guess. So that's some of the gear I use to do archaeology. And I also have much, much more. Sorry about that. This is the unit that I use when I'm doing deeper dives or longer dives. And rather than using Scuba, which stands for a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, this is called a closed circuit rebreather. And basically when I breathe on this, it has electronics in it that recycle all of my air that I'm breathing and then let me breathe it again. So I can dive on this for a very long time, sometimes up to 8 hours at a time I could be underwater on this. So when I put that on, it looks a little different, but basically. I can breathe like this underwater for 8 hours. All right, do we have any questions yet about my gear?
Yeah, that's awesome, Tori. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. And if you're ready, we'll bring the students into the conversation. I want to remind anyone who's watching the live stream, just drop your questions into the chat bar and we'll get to as many as we can. I want to go right to Anjali. Anjali, if you're ready with your question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah. So what's the most interesting thing you found on the ocean floor?
That's such a hard question that I always really struggle with. I think one of my favorite things that I found that was most exciting for me, I found some horseshoes on a shipwreck that I was working on that was dated to the early to mid 16th century in the Dominican Republic. And just seeing those, knowing that they were some of the earliest horseshoes that came into that part of the world, it was very interesting.
Good question, Anjali. Anjali, let me pose to you also the question that Tori asked earlier. Why do you think there were Chinese ceramics on a Spanish ship that she found in the Caribbean? Do you have any guesses?
No.
No? All right, well, let's go over to Elliot. Elliot, do you have any guesses as to that question before you ask yours?
Maybe they were imported to and then they were then sold to the Dominican Republic. Just a guess.
Close. It was something like that. Basically, at that point in time, by the early 18th century, Spain had two different fleets going, and the fleets would basically meet up, and one would stop and pick up imports from across the Pacific, and then they would meet back up and they would travel around Central and South America and the Caribbean to pick up the rest of the stuff that they were planning to trade or take.
Yeah, so, good guess, Elliot.
Shipwreck in the Dominican Republic, we started looking at what was on it, trying to identify it, and after finding out that it was probably a Spanish wreck, some Chinese ceramics started to pop up.
Very cool. All right, Elliot. Sorry, go ahead, ask your question.
So my question is, how have the various sites you've explored impacted your broader understanding of climate change, like just as a whole?
Yeah, of course. Seeing the change from like hurricanes and storms coming through firsthand is really, really interesting. We find a lot of trash on our dives, so we try to be good citizens and pick up what we can and do cleanup dives and that kind of thing. But yes, I believe that each person can do their part and make a big difference, that's for sure, because I've seen divers around me do it every day.
All right, Elliot, great question. Anjali, would you like to ask another question? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself. There you go.
So like, what time periods are you most likely to find like your ships from?
Really depends where you're working. I consider myself a Caribbean archaeologist and I work on earlier sites. But most of the stuff that most of the sites that I work on are anywhere from the 16th to 19th century. So a big span.
All right, so 300 years worth of shipwrecks to draw from. Do you find that there are a lot of shipwrecks to choose from when you're in the Caribbean? Are there a lot of things on the bottom?
Yeah, there are a lot of shipwrecks all over the place, especially in areas that are treacherous, like the Florida Keys that have a huge reef system, that ships would wreck on, or something like that. Shipwrecks are pretty prevalent. You just have to know what you're looking for.
All right, Anjali, great question. Elliot, let's go back to you. Go ahead and ask your next question.
So what are a few of the steps that it takes to do the type of underwater research that you do?
Yeah, so the first thing is that I have a degree in archaeology. I went to college to be an anthropologist in archaeology, an archaeologist, and I'm still a student. I'm working on a PhD right now. And also you have to be a diver. So my biggest thing has been putting time into diving. I've gotten certifications up through Dive Master now, and I'm a technical diver, so I use some more complicated gear. But the main steps to be an archaeologist, you have to have a good question and you have to be able to go try to answer that question by using Scuba or some other similar apparatus.
All right, great question, Elliot. We have a fourth grader on our live stream who would like to know, where have you not done scuba diving but would like to go either for research or for pleasure?
Oh, I haven't been so many places yet. I want to go everywhere. I'm making a very long list. I would say the top of my list right now would be to dive in Egypt or to dive in the Arctic. Those are two places that I would really like to go soon.
Cool. Just out of curiosity, what is it about those places that you find interesting?
The biodiversity in the Red Sea is something that I'm not very familiar with, and they have great shipwrecks too. And the Arctic, I think that it would be pretty amazing to dive around, the icebergs and glaciers and everything.
All right, great. We have another fourth grader on our live stream who would like to know, what's your favorite thing about scuba diving?
Oh, my favorite thing about scuba diving. I love everything about scuba diving, first of all. I love being on boats and something about being underwater and only being able to hear or feel yourself breathe most of the time. It's just an experience that I love, and that's what I go for, I guess.
What is it like to be underwater for 8 hours? I didn't know that a rebreather would allow you to stay underwater for 8 hours. That's a long time.
Yeah, sometimes I try not to dive that long. Normally you're cold or hungry or cranky or tired by then. But it's really useful for like cave divers who, can't really just pick up and leave off where they're at. You have to go or come back. And it's really useful for mapping shipwrecks because we can sit in, 10 feet of water for hours and get the whole shipwreck mapped without really having any issues.
All right.
Tired.
Anjali, do you have another question you'd like to ask?
So how do you get things from the ships without damaging it?
Yeah, so I don't really move anything or dig anything up. Most people think that archaeologists are kind of like Indiana Jones, but I really just record everything where it's at. So I try to float above it so I'm not messing with anything in the environment. And the saying is to take only photos and leave only bubbles. So I really try to do that.
It looks like you leave a lot of bubbles when you go to some of these places, judging by the pictures.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing, and maybe this is a question we can ask Elliot. Elliot, what did you think she sounded like when she had that scuba regulator in her mouth? Does it remind you of anybody?
I really have no clue.
No, not a Star Wars fan?
I was gonna say Darth Vader.
Yeah, that was my guess too. Are we right?
Dolly's even wearing a Star Wars shirt. She planned it.
Anjali, I think you're right on. That's exactly what she reminded me of too. Elliot, go ahead and ask your question.
Based on your experiences so far, what advice would you give to those looking to pursue a similar career in underwater archaeology?
I would say no matter what you want to do in underwater science, the most important things are that you know that you can have questions that maybe aren't directly related that you can answer through this, and to keep your scuba skills sharp or to work towards being a diver. Really, at the end of the day, I can be an archaeologist above or under the water, but if I'm not a good diver, then I can't do my job.
Right, good question, Elliot. We have a question from Ben on the live stream. He is a first grader, and he wants to know if the Spanish artillery that you showed, if it still shoots.
So the Spanish artillery that I showed, it's dated to the 16th century. It may shoot if you had all the right parts and it wasn't all encrusted with coral from being under the ocean for a few hundred years. But there definitely is some artillery you find on shipwrecks that could very likely shoot still.
Okay, great question. Let's see. Alex, fourth grader on our live stream, would like to know, what is the longest and deepest dive you have ever done?
So I don't dive as deep as a lot of my archaeologist friends. The deepest dive that I've done is to 130 feet. And those dives, normally you don't spend a whole lot of time at the bottom because you have to decompress as you get shallower. So the deepest dive I've been to is 130 and the longest dive is about 4 hours.
Okay, and what is it like at 130 feet below the surface of the ocean?
Oh, it depends where you are. You can normally see light from the surface still. and it just feels like you're a lot farther from where you can breathe air. It looks similar to your background, just a little bit darker.
Okay. All right. Well, good reference. We have a fifth grader on our live stream, Tori, who would like to know, have you ever faced any challenges in your work? And if so, how have you overcome them?
Oh, I definitely have. I face a lot of challenges. It's harder for me to dive in cold water because I have to wear more gear. And I guess the way I face that is I practice and practice and practice with the things that I have trouble with the most, so that I am comfortable and I know what I'm doing when I need to. Also, it's a challenge for me sometimes to get myself to not go diving and to stay at home and do my homework, or, to stay in the library, but that's just as much a part of it too. So.
Where are you? I know that you're sort of in the Indiana, Wisconsin area of the United States. Where are your favorite places to dive in the Midwest?
Ooh, in the Midwest, the Great Lakes have really awesome shipwrecks. I love diving Lake Michigan, and I've been all over the coast of Wisconsin and Indiana diving those shipwrecks. Otherwise, I spend most of my time in the Caribbean.
All right, very cool. And Jolly, Elliot, I want to give you both a chance to ask another question if you have them. And Jolly, do you want to go ahead?
So what tools do you like for the robots? Like not you exactly, but like how do they like map everything down on the floor?
So the ROV, the yellow robot that I showed you, it's a remotely operated vehicle. And basically it's this little robot that lets it maneuver around underwater, kind of like a drone would in the air. And it's attached to a line and a cable, and it has a camera and lights and little claws on it. So we control where it goes with like the little, basically video game controller, through that cord that goes all the way down. If it's at 600 feet, you have to have 600 feet of cord to get it there. And then you're watching what it's doing through the video. So technically I'm still mapping stuff on the boat, just through a robot, through a video, a few hundred feet down.
Cool, great question, and Jolly. It actually reminded me of something I wrote down while you were speaking, Tori. I just have a note that says underwater paper, question mark, question mark, question mark. What is underwater paper? How do you take notes underwater?
Yeah, so there are a few ways we do it. One is called Mylar, and it's basically just like a plasticky paper. It's really hard to tear, and you can write on it in lead and then erase it or whatever if you need. And then also we use like hard plastic slates. So.
Okay, very interesting. Elliot, your turn. Go ahead.
My question is, what are some of the pros and cons of working underwater?
Ooh, some of the pros and cons. The pros, fun sometimes. I love getting to go to work out on a boat. I get to work with a lot of really fun people and see really interesting things. Sometimes the weather isn't great. I get to work in conditions that aren't very fun and in visibility that's not good, or maybe some environments that some people would find scary. But I like most of it.
Is there anything about diving that you find scary, or anything that gives you pause while you're underwater?
I think most people are scared of sharks. Sharks don't really bother you underwater. I'm always really excited to see sharks. I think maybe I'm more scared of snakes underwater, like freshwater snakes, but that's just because I'm scared of snakes.
All right, awesome. Let's see. I know that we have a couple more questions on our live stream. We have a couple more minutes to go. If you have any more questions, live stream or on-camera students, let me know, raise your hand digitally or drop them into the live chat. Rachel would like to know what you hope to do when you graduate from your PhD. Where do you see this taking you?
So there are a few different ways that I can be an underwater archaeologist. Most work for either the government, they work for an academic institution, or they work for a private firm. I likely will stay in academia, just because I have the freedom there to do the research I want in exchange for teaching scientific diving or doing their research. So.
Okay, very cool. Well, Anjali, Elliot, either of you have any other questions you want to ask? All right, Elliot, yeah, go ahead.
When doing your research, how are you being mindful of and minimizing your impact on the environment?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I normally try to like float over whatever I'm recording, not lay on the bottom or something like that. Sometimes that means floating there for a few hours and mapping something. But also I try not to disturb any of the wildlife or the corals or anything growing. So
All right, yeah, good question. How hard is it to not sink and not float? Just sort of find a spot, a depth, and stay there.
yeah, that's where your dive skills come in. The more you do, the better you get at it, but it's definitely challenging when you have a current or heavy gear or something.
Okay, Anjali, I see you with your hand up. Go ahead.
How old were you when you like started to like get an interest in swimming and then like diving and then like?
So I grew up around the water. I went to the lakes a lot when I was little, but I was never a diver until I went to college, and I got certified as a scuba diver when I was 18. So right now I'm not probably that much older than you, and I think I have brothers and sisters that are probably your age. So I haven't been diving for very long, but I do a lot of it. And I found out about it through school.
Cool. And like Tori said before, are you 10 o'clock, or I'm sorry, 10 is the age where you can start to get scuba certified.
Is the age.
What are some of the other levels of scuba? There's a basic scuba certification. What other sort of additional certifications can someone who wants to dive get?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ways to get certified, first of all. There are plenty of grants and scholarships. You even, at the age of 10, you can look for to help you get scuba certified if you're interested. You can learn through those through Google. And sorry, what was your question, Tim?
Yeah, sure. Like what are once you get your basic scuba certification, what are some other specialty diving things that you can do?
And that would start with your open water, which is a basic certification. From there, they move up in a progression. There's advanced open water, there's a rescue diver, dive master, instructor, and then there are technical certifications and specialty certifications. So you could get certified to be an underwater naturalist if you're really good at identifying fish. Or you could get specialized as a scientific diver if you're really good at going out and doing citizen science, or something like that.
Awesome. I want to close with one question that we ask a lot of our live stream guests, and we know a lot of explorers and underwater adventurers are sort of stuck at home like the rest of us because of COVID-19. What will be your next adventure once you're free to go and resume your work?
Oh, I think my next trip may be to Mexico. I'm hoping to go look at a shipwreck there that some friends are working on. But for now, I'm doing backyard archaeology. I'm very interested in going in my backyard and looking for some answers that I have. So.
All right, very cool. Well, great questions from everyone. Thank you so much, Tori, for joining us today. I really appreciate our on-camera students and our live stream audience for coming today with such great questions. There's so much to learn about underwater archaeology, and it was so great to see how scuba works. We've talked with so many oceans experts this week who are scuba divers, and it's really, really neat to see the gear and see what it does while also learning about underwater archaeology. So thank you so much, Tori. This has been a ton of fun. Tomorrow is our last day of Oceans Week, believe it or not. It's going to be a big one at Reach the World. We'll be connecting with youth leaders from island nations around the world, and we're hosting a Spanish language event about coral restoration efforts in Mexico. So it's going to be our grand Ocean Week finale, and you won't want to miss it. We hope you can join us. You can check out the complete list of upcoming Oceans Week events at athome.reachtheworld.org. So with that, I'm going to unmute our friends Anjali and Elliot, and together with me, let's give our guest Tori a big thank you and a goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Tori.
thank you.